Looks like maybe we've got quite a few people logged in, so I'm going to get started. Hi, I'm Beth Stofflet. I chair the events committee for Madison Trust for Historic Preservation. So welcome to Madison Trust for Historic Preservation's presentation on the history and development of Madison's railroads with speaker Scott Lothes. Welcome to our members as well as our guests, including many of our friends that are interested in railroads and railroad photography. So thanks for joining us. Like many communities, railroads were impacted by the landscape around them. And Scott's going to tell us how they impacted the Madison landscape in particular. But before we get started, I want to say a few words about Madison Trust for Historic Preservation. We are a private 501c3 nonprofit organization operating in Madison, Wisconsin, and we celebrate and advocate for the preservation of historic places in the Madison area. And so to foster that advocacy, we share the stories of Madison's historic places with programs like this, as well as with our popular architectural walking tours. So I invite you to explore our website for more information, including how to become a member. And that you just need to search for Madison Trust for Historic Preservation. Our sponsors for tonight's program are Architectural Building Arts, Bachman Construction, and Fiore Companies. And we thank them for their generous support making tonight's presentation possible. Before I forget, I also want to say this because I tend to forget this. I want to mention that your microphones will be muted during the presentation so that Scott can go through his presentation and have that flow. But we'll have time for questions at the end where you'll be able to either send in a question through the chat function or unmute yourself at the end of the presentation. It also might be of interest to some of those watching tonight to know that Madison Trust for Historic Preservation is partnering with the Center for Railroad Photography and Art for our September 17th specialty tour. So that will be one of our walking tours, visiting some of the areas impacted by railroads that Scott's going to talk about tonight. So that should be really interesting. You can find out more information about that on our website or our newsletters. It should be a great tour, and I'm really looking forward to it. And speaking of looking forward to things, we've got a wonderful presentation tonight. Our speaker, Scott Lothes, has been on the staff of Madison-based Center for Railroad Photography since 2008, where he served as president, executive director, and editor of its quarterly journal, Railroad Heritage. Going back to his childhood in West Virginia, Scott developed an interest in railroads and landscapes. In college at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, he took up photography. And Scott brings it all together with his many writings and photographs that appear in Trains, Classic Trains, Railfan and Railroad, and other magazines and newspapers, as well as contributions to 7 books on railroad photography. He currently lives on Madison's west side with his wife, Maureen Muldoon, and their dog, Maddie. I was lucky enough to see a preview of tonight's presentation, and I think we were really in for a treat tonight. So Scott, if you're ready, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Beth, and thanks to you, Jennifer, and everyone at the Madison Trust for Historic Preservation for the opportunity to share some of our railroad history with you tonight. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, too. I finally took one of the Madison Trust specialty tours last summer and enjoyed it immensely. I have to say, though, that after being privileged to that tour with guide Michael Bridgman, I'm not honestly sure that I know as much about railroads as Michael knows about architecture. So we'll see what we can do here tonight. My wife and I are definitely planning on taking more of those tours, including the Mad Mid Mod this summer that we're really excited about. All of us at the Center for Railroad Photography and Art are thrilled to be partnering with the Madison Trust on this year's specialty tour about the West Rail Corridor, and that led to our idea for tonight's presentation. So let's get this started, and I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Jennifer, does that look good? Just give me a thumbs up. All right. Well, let's get this train out of the station then. So for most people in Madison today, experiences with trains are somewhat rare and often involve getting stuck at a railroad crossing, or maybe the more pleasant sensation of hearing a whistle across town on a warm summer evening. Remember those warm summer evenings? But that wasn't always the case. Railroads helped build Madison into the city we know today, and they have left deep imprints. Even those few trains that still run, the ones that might get in your way at University Avenue or John Nolan Drive, continue to play a key role in our regional economy. At their zenith, 9 different railroad lines fanned out from Madison. 7 of these remain in service today, although only 4 extend to their original destinations. Tonight, I'm going to talk about all of these lines, including their histories, their evolutions, and their impacts. And I'll come back to this map a lot. But before we go any further, I also want to add a disclaimer. Railroad history, like the history of any subject, is multidimensional. For more than a century, railroads touched nearly every facet of American life. Even today, when trains roam in the shadows of our landscape, they remain integral to the global supply chain. You can approach railroads from nearly any perspective: business, labor, race, gender, land use, geography, popular culture, on and on. It's one of the reasons why railroads have held my interest for literally my entire life. This is a photograph by John Gruber, who I'll introduce shortly, showing Wisconsin's 32nd Infantry Division being deployed by train from Madison due to the Berlin crisis in 1961. Now, many historians approach railroads by focusing on their construction, particularly their financing and the personalities behind them. Both of those, financing and personalities, were usually complicated and almost always interesting. My primary interest is in how these lines were used after they were built and how they've evolved since then. So that's the perspective I'll bring, and it's only one of many different perspectives you can apply to railroad history. Now, none of our railroad lines arrived in Madison here by accident. Each one was the result of a strategic and expensive project. Some of these exceeded their builders' high expectations, others struggled, all of them have changed. But to understand why, we have to look beyond the city, to the regional, continental, and even international trends that have affected our railroads here. I'll be illustrating my talk with a lot of photographs, including some of my own, a few from the Library of Congress and the Wisconsin Historical Society, and then quite a few from our archive at the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. Let me say a few words about the center. Our mission is to preserve and present significant images of railroading. Railroads and photography came of age together in the 19th century. This is a glass plate from our Jim Shaughnessy collection. And that visual tradition is still vibrant today. This is a 2019 photograph by Justin Franz, one of our board members, showing young and old photographers with Union Pacific's recently restored Big Boy steam locomotive in Ogden, Utah. There are hundreds of railroad museums and historical societies, but the center is the only one focusing on railroading's visual culture. We also have a pretty unique business model. We don't have a museum or gallery space of our own. What we have in Madison is a business office and an archival storage facility. From these, we maintain a growing collection of more than 500,000 images that provide much of the material for everything else we do. Now, that includes preparing exhibitions that go to museums and galleries all over the country. This one was our biggest at the Chicago History Museum. And we also host conferences, events, and presentations. This is from our 2022 conference at Lake Forest College, just north of Chicago. We have another one coming up April 14th through 16th of this year, if anyone's interested. We also make annual awards for creative imagery. And we publish books as well as a quarterly journal called Railroad Heritage. Like the Madison Trust, we're a nonprofit organization supported primarily by our community of members. You can learn more on our website, railphoto-art.org, or you can follow us on social media. We're at railphotoart on all of the major platforms. You can also watch our online presentations on our YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/railphotoart. And if you're wondering why we're in Madison, it's because our founder, John Gruber, lived here. John spent most of his career in publications at the University of Wisconsin. He was a talented photographer, author, editor, and researcher. I'll be sharing many of his photographs with you this evening. John perceived the need for a railroad organization focused on imagery, and he did the work and had the connections to get it off the ground. We've attracted a tremendous all-volunteer board of directors from all over the country, with a wide range of experience and expertise. And Madison is a great location for us. It's a wonderful city, close to the nation's rail hub of Chicago, and we found several outstanding interns and staff members from the University of Wisconsin's iSchool and elsewhere, as we've grown our team from 1 person to 10 in the time I've been here. So let's look at Madison. When Wisconsin became the 30th state in 1848, it had no railroads. In 40 years, less time than I've been alive, Madison's railroad map was complete. The first line here was an extension of the first railroad in the state, which connected Milwaukee with Waukesha in 1851 and reached Madison 3 years later, coming up through Milton, Edgerton, Stoughton, and McFarland, then across Monona Bay to a terminal at West Washington Avenue, a railroad location we still recognize today. Here it is in 1873, looking east up Washington toward the Capitol. You can see a corner of the depot at far left. When the tracks arrived in 1854, they belonged to the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad, chartered to build from Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. Now, in the 19th century, many railroads were chartered with grandiose plans but failed to reach their aspirations. But this one did, going west from Madison and arriving in Prairie du Sac in 1857. So within a decade of statehood, Wisconsin had a railroad running all the way across it. Like many early railroads, it connected established waterways. Both of its endpoints were major ports with dense populations and heavy industry. This is an 1854 drawing of Milwaukee with ships quite prominent in Lake Michigan. And this is Prairie du Sac in 1870 with both steamboats and the railroad shown down there at bottom middle. The upper right is the Wisconsin River, whose broad and gentle valley provided a natural path for most of the Milwaukee and Mississippi's route west from Madison, as well as proximity to the lead mines that were then a big part of our regional economy. Now, a third line had also arrived by 1857, the Watertown and Madison Railroad from Watertown, which provided a second route to Milwaukee. The Panic of 1857 and then the Civil War slowed rail construction all over the country, but our fourth line arrived in 1864 before the war ended. And that was the Chicago and Northwestern, reaching all the way up from Chicago by way of Janesville. This line also crossed Monona Bay, and so it had to cross the Milwaukee and Mississippi track. Now, where two railroads cross at grade, that's called a diamond, since the intersecting rails make that shape. This spot in Monona Bay became known as the Diamond in the Lake, and it's a pretty unique railroad location. Diamond crossings themselves are common. Madison would eventually have at least 6 of them, some with multiple diamonds, but this might be the only one in the world located in the middle of a lake. This is my drone photograph from January of 2022, and this is a wider, higher view of the same train, plenty of ice fishermen out there too. The train is on the former Milwaukee and Mississippi, bound for Janesville and ultimately Chicago. The former Chicago and Northwestern line is on the causeway at left, and to the right, that track reaches the isthmus. You can even see Monona Terrace all the way over there at far right. And at the far side of the isthmus, the Northwestern had to build diamonds with the Madison and Watertown Railroad, which wound up right in the middle of Blair Street, seen here at the upper left in this 1936 Angus McVicker photograph, which looks east. Williamson Street and Machinery Row would be just out of frame to the right. Now, railroads are legally obligated to allow other railroads to cross them with diamonds, but whoever gets there first gets to be in charge. And that explains this 1955 scene looking the other way from Blair Street, where we have a streamlined Chicago and Northwestern passenger train that had to wait for a lowly Milwaukee Road switcher pulling a few freight cars. The Milwaukee Road got there first, they got to be in control. Now, back in the 19th century, Madison's next line arrived in 1870 when the Madison and Portage Railroad connected those two cities. It joined Madison and Watertown at East Wilson and Baldwin Streets. And at this point, one of the 2 major rail systems in Madison was complete. The corporate history of U.S. railroading is an endless series of mergers and acquisitions, and 4 of these lines came under the control of a big railroad called the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, better known as the Milwaukee Road, and it truly became Wisconsin's hometown railroad. It built and assembled a dense network of track throughout the upper Midwest, and then in 1909 it completed its Pacific extension all the way to Puget Sound, later becoming the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific. It even reached the Ohio River at Louisville, Kentucky. Now, the Milwaukee Road's growth into an 11,000-mile network was a two-edged sword for Madison. On one hand, passengers and freight here had far more options within the network of a single carrier, but on the other hand, the Milwaukee Road lines in Madison were eventually relegated to secondary status. Now, to understand why that happened, let's take a look at the state rail map from 1900. Now, the Milwaukee Road lines are the reddish-orange ones, and you can see they went almost everywhere. Let's zoom in now on the southern part of the state. I've already mentioned the Madison and Portage and the Madison and Watertown railroads, which are these two lines here. Many other railroads came under the control of the Milwaukee Road, including one that ran straight between Watertown and Portage going through Columbus up here. It essentially forms the hypotenuse of a right triangle with Madison at the bottom left corner. Now remember from geometry class that the hypotenuse is shorter than the two legs, and consider that one of these legs, the Madison and Portage, had to climb out of the Ohio River Valley, go over Arlington Hill, and then descend into the Wisconsin River Valley. Now that required a grade of nearly 1.5%, which means 1.5 feet of vertical rise per 100 feet of horizontal travel. Now that may not sound very steep, but it's about twice as steep as most other railroad grades in the area. The whole enterprise of railroading is based on the very low rolling resistance of a flanged metal wheel on a metal rail. That resistance increases drastically with grades and curves. For any locomotive, if you double the steepness of the grade, you can only pull about half as many cars up that hill, and that's on straight track. Curves reduce that factor even more. So railroads want to be as straight and as flat as possible, and the hypotenuse between Watertown and Portage is both straighter and flatter than those legs that go through Madison. Now this also matters because of the further connections. To the east, the Milwaukee Road runs to Chicago, which became the railroad hub of the entire continent. If you want to know why, read Bill Cronin's fantastic book, Nature's Metropolis. To the west, the Milwaukee Road runs to La Crosse, and then it heads up the Mississippi River to St. Paul and Minneapolis. By the 1890s, most of the North American rail network had been built. Trains had come to dominate transportation, and the Twin Cities would have two different railroads running to the West Coast. The continental US had been complete since the 1850s, and trade was moving across much greater distances, thanks mainly to the railroads. One of the most important railroad corridors in the upper Midwest runs between Chicago and the Twin Cities. This map comes from Trains magazine, and it shows only those railroad lines that had especially heavy traffic in the early 1970s. But the point of this map is to show you that north of Chicago, every one of those lines with heavy traffic ran to the Twin Cities. The Milwaukee Road had one of the best routes, but it didn't go through Madison. It went through Watertown, Columbus, and Portage. And so that's where the long-haul freight trains and the streamlined passenger trains ran. This is the Milwaukee Road's flagship train, the Olympian Hiawatha, bound for Tacoma, in a beautiful view from the top of the tunnel at Tunnel City, Wisconsin, looking west into the hazy bluffs rising towards the Mississippi Valley. What came through Madison on the Milwaukee Road were primarily regional and local trains, but that's not to say we suffered from poor service here. All four of our Milwaukee Road lines had daily freight and passenger trains for most of the 20th century. The 1940 timetable lists 8 passenger trains daily in each direction between Madison and Milwaukee that ran via Watertown. There were 3 more that ran between Madison and Milwaukee via Milton. There were 2 passenger trains each way between Madison and Portage, and they made timely connections with those mainline trains going to the Twin Cities and the West Coast. There were also 3 pairs of daily trains that ran directly between Madison and Chicago, bypassing Milwaukee by way of Janesville. The fastest of these, called the Varsity, made that run in 3 hours flat. It did so in 1940 with a coal-burning steam locomotive, an hour faster than the bus can get you there today. This Gruber photograph shows a diesel-powered Varsity in 1963 crossing Monona Bay, and its amenities included a full-length dome car in the middle of the train. Going west from Madison, there were also 3 pairs of passenger trains each day. In 1874, the Milwaukee Road had built a remarkable pontoon bridge over the Mississippi River to Marquette, Iowa. This 1885 cyanotype by Henry Peter Boss shows the bridge opened at upper right. This section actually floated on pontoons and trains ran across it. In front of it, by the sawmill, there are some massive log rafts of white pine from the north. All of those Milwaukee Road trains crossed this bridge, and one of them, called the Sioux, went all the way to Rapid City, South Dakota. Now, the Milwaukee Road's facilities in Madison were always in the 600 block of West Washington Avenue, dating back to our first railroad in 1854. The first depot was actually built a year earlier in anticipation of the railroad's arrival. The one shown here came later, a 2-story wood building with an eastbound train in front of it, and this structure was replaced 8 years later with the station we still have today. This 2-story brick building with limestone trim, designed in the neoclassical style by the Chicago-based architecture firm Frost & Granger. I'll say a little bit more about them later. A striking feature about the depot for me is that it only had one platform, meaning that just one train at a time could receive or discharge passengers. Now, when this was a busy place, that must have been a bottleneck, although for decades the Milwaukee Road had a second depot in Madison. It was called East Madison, and it was located at East Wilson and South Franklin Streets. The first structure was built in 1869 and was a pretty simple 1-story affair. This view looks west on Williamson Street, and you can just barely make out the Capitol above the depot in the background. As the city grew, the railroad built larger structures here, including this one, seen circa 1918, which was later replaced by a Hipbruth depot similar in style to the larger one at West Washington. You can see the depot here in the middle of this striking McVicker image. By this time, the Milwaukee Road was calling the station Franklin Street, which came in from the right. That's Blair Street in the foreground, and the view looks straight up Wilson Street on the right there. This station lasted until 1952, when the railroad consolidated all of its passenger operations to West Washington. And here it is in a 1956 Gruber color slide with a couple of freight trains in front of it. The Milwaukee Road's freight traffic through Madison was also pretty substantial, mostly agricultural products and manufactured goods made in Wisconsin. Much of that went to Chicago and beyond via connections with Eastern railroads. As late as the 1970s, the Milwaukee Road dispatched a big freight train every evening from Madison to Chicago. And right behind the engines, it always carried 15 or 20 loaded cars from the Oscar Mayer plant on the east side of town. That plant was a hive of activity in this 1942 aerial photograph. This view looks north from Commercial Avenue, and Packers Avenue now runs just to the right. You can see a long string of those insulated boxcars on the curved track at lower left, and they have rooftop hatches where blocks of ice were loaded to keep them cool. And at one time, some of that ice even came from our lakes here in Madison. At upper left, the railroad cutting a diagonal through the frame is the Madison and Portage line. Let's head back downtown now with another aerial photograph, this one from 1956. It shows all of the Milwaukee Road's key structures in Madison for both freight and passenger traffic. We're looking west here, and that's West Washington cutting across the lower left corner. In the lower right corner is the Hotel Washington, which burned in 1996. The new development there does include a commemorative plaque and a nice historic photograph. The Hipbruth Depot is in the middle, and to the right is the baggage building that is now the Harvey House restaurant. Much of the architectural history of railroading focuses on depots and stations, especially the larger and grander ones, and rightly so. But I'm equally fascinated by the more utilitarian vernacular architecture of railroading. And that's Regent Street at top middle. Just below it is the Milwaukee Road's roundhouse, whose location, I think, caused that jog there in Regent Street that still exists today. And that's just a hunch, and I would love to confirm it. The roundhouse inscribed nearly a half circle at the time and had 18 stalls. That's where steam locomotives went to be serviced and repaired between their runs, and where they went for their regular federally mandated inspections. Reciprocating steam locomotives required almost constant maintenance, and roundhouses were clever designs. Their stalls get bigger with more space in between each track as you move toward the outer wall. So pulling in the locomotives so that they face that outer wall provided more room between them to work on their most complex machinery. You can even see vents on the roof that line up with the engine smokestacks. You can see these here on the left side of the roundhouse. Now, the turntable in the middle provided easy access to every stall while also turning each locomotive in the proper direction for its next run. In the far upper right corner is the coaling tower, which was used to store and replenish the coal that fueled these locomotives. Now, if you're in Madison, you don't need me to tell you how little of this remains today. The turntable and roundhouse are completely gone, and the City Stations Shopping Center now occupies that site. Demolition came in stages. In 1983, just 6 stalls of the roundhouse were still standing. Remember, it had 18 at one time. And a year later, the freight station was being torn down. This view looks east with the passenger depot in the distance at far right. Going back to the aerial photograph, you can see the freight station in better times at the upper right corner. In the opposite corner, West Washington crossed no fewer than 12 tracks. There's just one there still today. The only visible protection is a pair of crossbuck warning signs with flashing lights located in the middle of the street. There were no gates, despite exponentially more trains than we have now. There was, however, manual crossing protection in another piece of great vernacular architecture just out of view to the left. An elevated watchman's tower, seen here in this 1963 John Gruber photograph from inside the cab of a diesel locomotive. On the left side is the former Kroger warehouse with 3 boxcars on its spur track for unloading. Now, for the photographer lucky enough to be allowed upstairs in that tower, it offered a commanding view. Now, this is a Milwaukee-bound passenger train getting ready to pull out in this winter scene from 1956. So that was the Milwaukee Road. Now let's take a look at their main competitor here, the Chicago and Northwestern. We already touched on the Northwestern's first line into Madison, which arrived from Chicago in 1864 and made that diamond crossing in Monona Bay. By 1873, the railroad had extended that line north and west to Baraboo and Reedsburg. It crossed the Wisconsin River at Merrimack, seen here with a streamlined passenger train in 1960. And it ran along the eastern shore of Devil's Lake, seen with a steam-powered passenger train in 1952. The railroad played a key role in developing tourism there. Now, to tap into the agricultural bounty of southwestern Wisconsin, in 1881, the Northwestern built a line west from Madison to Dodgeville, Platteville, and eventually to Galena, Illinois. It split off from their Chicago line at Olin Avenue near the bottom middle of this map. And finally, to better compete with the Milwaukee Road, in 1882, the Northwestern built its own line between Madison and Milwaukee through Cottage Grove and Lake Mills. So at this point, in less than 30 years, the 2 biggest railroads in Madison had fully staked their claims to the city. Now, I should note that several other companies and subsidiaries were involved in these projects, but I'm not going to wade into those weeds. They're well documented elsewhere. Now, unlike the Milwaukee Road, Madison was very much a mainline stop for the Chicago and Northwestern. Its routes appear in dark blue here, and northwest from Madison, the line along Devil's Lake extended to Elroy, where it connected with a subsidiary that ran through Black River Falls and Eau Claire to the Twin Cities. And as trade grew between the Twin Cities and Chicago, traffic swelled on this line through Madison. The The railroad built a freight yard and locomotive shop on the east side of town to handle much of this business. Their roundhouse was just north of East Johnson Street at Fordham Avenue. Part of it actually still stands today and is home to Apex Property Management. The Northwestern had wanted to work with the Milwaukee Road on a Union passenger station, but the Milwaukee wasn't interested. So the Northwestern built its own passenger station at Blair and Williamson Streets. I haven't found a photograph of the first one, but this postcard shows the second, built in 1885 and with a hotel and restaurant inside. The current structure dates from 1910 and was the Northwestern's response to the new Milwaukee Road Depot on West Washington. The Northwestern also used the architecture firm of Frost and Granger, and they used limestone from Indiana in the neoclassical style here. Frost and Granger were also working on a new terminal for the Northwestern in Chicago, and they included some intentional similarities with it. And that's worth noting. Railroads were pioneers of using standard designs to help establish their brands, kind of the franchises of the day. A little bit more about Frost and Granger. Charles Frost and Alfred Granger worked together for only a dozen years, but their output was prodigious, especially for the Chicago and Northwestern. I believe they did more than 100 depots and other projects for them. Both Frost and Granger had married a daughter of Marvin Hewitt, the railroad's president, perhaps some connection to all the work they had there. Now, by the time of this Gruber photograph from 1982, the passenger platforms had already been removed. They would have been on the right side of the depot there, the part in shadow. But you can see them here with that wonderful Northwestern neon sign in this 1957 color slide as a kind of dirty Northwestern passenger train pulls in. The Northwestern facilities extended from the depot at Blair Street, and they filled most of the space between Main and Williamson Streets, all the way out to Baldwin. This 1955 photograph looks west from Livingston, and you can see the Capitol here in the background. Perhaps the least remarked of our depots was South Madison, which was on the main line to Chicago at Lakeside Street, right across the tracks from where the coffee house is today. And I still need to learn more about this depot. Now, in any case, all of the mainline Chicago and Northwestern trains running through Madison face some challenges to the northwest. To get to the bridge at Merrimack, seen here with the 1965 circus train out of Baraboo, the Northwestern climbs away from the Yahara River and descends into the Wisconsin River Valley by going over Dane Hill on 1% grades. Now, this line has steeper grades and sharper curves than most others on the Northwestern system in the area, and this is the second time I've made this point. It's important. Our local geography and the regional traffic patterns put Madison's rail lines at a disadvantage. Now, as business boomed and the trains became heavier, they really had to slog to get over this line. This is the circus train again, climbing the grade of Dane Hill, just south of Lodi. In the early 20th century, the Chicago and Northwestern was a wealthy and profitable company, and you can bet that its board of directors envied the Milwaukee Road with its straighter, flatter, shorter main line through Columbus. So the Northwestern decided to build their own brand new 140-mile railroad between Milwaukee and Wyville, nicknamed the Adams Line since it passed through Adams, Wisconsin, which became an important stop. Compared to the Madison route, the Adams Line was arrow straight and pancake flat, cutting a hard diagonal across the cardinal grid of the section roads. This map shows all of the Chicago and Northwestern lines in Wisconsin in 1910, and this was the original line from Chicago to the Twin Cities running through Madison. The proposed Adams Line is shown here as a dash line. Once it opened in 1911, long-distance trains now had this option running through Milwaukee. For the next half century, the Northwestern used these two lines pretty evenly, so service through Madison remained high. The 1956 timetable shows 5 pairs of daily trains between Madison and Chicago, all running via Janesville. Now, this is one of them departing in the background here. Now, 4 of those trains ran beyond Madison to the northwest. There was a local that went all the way to Minneapolis, and the Duluth Superior Limited to those cities, also via Minneapolis. And then there were two trains that crossed the Mississippi River at Winona, Minnesota, and went to South Dakota, the Rochester Special to Huron, and the Dakota 400, which went all the way to Rapid City. The Northwestern was also running one local train each way between Milwaukee and Madison at this time, but that was down from 5 trains each way back in 1914. There was no passenger service to the Southwest in 1956, but in 1914 there were 3 pairs of daily trains between Madison and Galena. Like the Milwaukee Road, the Northwestern also ran long freight trains through Madison. The majority of them would have been on the main line between Chicago and the Northwest, seen here near Oregon, but the lines to Milwaukee and the southwest part of the state also had daily freight service. And just to complete the picture here, the third railroad in Madison was the Illinois Central, and it was a distant third compared to the much more robust Milwaukee Road and Chicago and Northwestern networks here. This was just a stub branch that came up from Freeport, Illinois, where it connected with the Illinois Central's main line running between Chicago and Iowa. The Madison branch was built between 1886 and 1888 as the Chicago, Madison, and Northern, although it never went north of Madison, and nor did it ever have anything more than local service. The 1929 timetable showed 2 pairs of trains that ran every day except Sunday, and they each took a little over 2 hours to cover the 62 miles to Freeport and back. The IC built their own passenger and freight stations in Madison, located on either side of West Washington, just northeast of the Milwaukee Road Depot. This is the passenger station and a view looking west from Main Street. Just beyond the covered passenger platform, the tracks cross West Washington, and then the freight station is the building just beyond that. Today, it's still here, and it is now part of U-Haul. Always busy in middle August for UW move-in. Now, I don't know much else about these structures, but I believe the passenger station may have been torn down sometime in the 1940s. A mixed-use building now occupies the site with a CVS at ground level and condos above. If you look closely, that building is actually called the Depot. At least a little bit of the history survives that way. Passenger trains made a relatively early exit from the Illinois Central in Madison, but freight service continued into the 1990s. Traffic volumes had gotten pretty low by then, though, as this 3-car train in the 1970s attests. But this line is still noteworthy for its earthworks, including the Stewart Tunnel, located near Belleville. Back in Madison, the Illinois Central had to cross the Milwaukee Road with a diamond just west of Park Street. This view looks west with a short IC train waiting for the Milwaukee Road train on the right. So that completes the Madison rail map. Railroads had profound economic and cultural impacts on the city and on the region, from the everyday movement of people and freight to special events that brought crowds to the tracks. Like those circus trains that ran between Baraboo and Milwaukee. This one is topping Dane Hill in 1967. And even whistle-stop campaign trains, like the one Gaylord Delson and Bronson La Follette used for the 1968 election. In the days when railroads went seemingly everywhere and touched seemingly everything, the steel boulevard of 4 tracks ran along Lake Monona, 2 for the Milwaukee Road on the right, 2 for the Chicago and Northwestern on the left, with the train there heading to Chicago. When Monona Terrace was built here in the 1990s, it was based on a design by Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright had made a series of designs for Monona Terrace beginning in 1938. All of those designs up through 1955 called for a Union passenger station here. We can dream. For more than a century, railroads were icons of industrial might. This powerful image of the Milwaukee Road coaling tower ran in the 1950 Wisconsin historical calendar. But as we already know, this era did not last. The decline of Madison railroads follows a national story. Railroads were far and away our most important form of transportation through World War II in the 1940s, but that had changed by the 1950s, and a sharp decline that continued through 2 decades. This was most visible to the public in two ways. The first was the wholesale shift from steam to diesel power. Diesels required far less maintenance than steam locomotives, meaning fewer railroad workers and less infrastructure. The Northwestern demolished its coaling tower near Commercial Avenue in 1957. The second was by the loss of passenger trains. The Milwaukee Road stopped running the Sioux to South Dakota in 1960 and closed its pontoon bridge over the Mississippi River the following year, turning that line into a freight-only stub that ends in Prairie du Sac. The view here looks south from the Highway 18 bridge as a short freight train crosses in 1961, just a month or so before the bridge closed for good. The Chicago and Northwestern ended its passenger service to South Dakota at the same time, cutting back its Dakota 400 to Minnesota and renaming it the Rochester 400. That lasted for just 3 years, when the Northwestern abolished the train altogether in 1963. Now, this photograph shows the last run, stopping at the Madison Depot. Milwaukee road service held on for a little longer and even included football specials that brought fans from Milwaukee to Badger games. This one was arriving on East Wilson Street on November 9th, 1968. The houses and the trees are still there, but you'd never know a railroad used to be. This is the same spot in the 1300 block in the spring of 2022. Back in 1968, the Badgers were terrible, going 2 consecutive seasons without a victory. On this day, they lost to undefeated Ohio State by a score of 43-8. Our football fortunes started to improve in the 1970s, but not our rail service. The last passenger train left Madison on April 30th, 1971, when the Milwaukee Roads varsity pulled out of West Washington on its final run to Chicago. A lot of freight traffic also left Madison. The Northwestern sent all of its long-distance trains to the Adams Line. This is North Lowell in 1978. Union Pacific still runs freight trains between Chicago and the Twin Cities over this route. And while most of the Northwestern tracks remain in Madison proper today, all of these lines were cut back to stubs. Part of the main line to Chicago was out of service south of Oregon, and northwest of Reedsburg, the tracks are completely gone. The line to Milwaukee remains only as far as Cottage Grove, and nearly all of the tracks that once reached into southwestern Wisconsin are also gone. Just a short piece remains south of Olin Drive, used for delivering boxcars of newsprint to the Capital Times. Now, the most obvious cause for rail's decline in Madison and across the country is technological. Cars, trucks, buses, and airplanes all emerged in the early 20th century and matured rapidly, especially after World War II. Each of these vehicles is better suited to certain transportation needs than trains are, although trains still have many advantages. Now, this photograph is from North Shore Drive in 1961. Trains were disadvantaged by a number of public policy decisions, perhaps none more prominent than the interstate highway system. Significant federal, state, and local funding helped build and continues to maintain our highways and airports, while railroads have to pay for the maintenance of their tracks and also pay taxes on them. Now, I would be remiss not to mention that railroads benefited mightily from federal and state land grants in the 19th century. By the middle of the 20th century, public policy had shifted, often putting railroads at disadvantages. U.S. railroads also occupy an odd place as private corporations that provide essential public services. Most are classified as common carriers, meaning they have an obligation to provide transportation, even when that means a money-losing one-car train, like this one at Sauk City. And now, due to their own greed, the railroads had been regulated heavily during their heyday in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But then many of those regulations remained in place, even as cars, trucks, and airplanes came onto the scene. And then railroads had dominated transportation for so long that leaders in both labor and management failed to realize the extent of these new threats until it was too late. Once considered too big to fail, railroads fell like dominoes. The many bankruptcies included the Milwaukee Road in 1977, whose once proud facilities at West Washington had become a sad sight. Then relief came in three forms. The first was Amtrak, created in 1971 to take over most long-distance passenger trains, relieving the private railroads of their obligation to provide what were, by then, money-losing services. This view is the Empire Builder in Wisconsin at Tunnel City. A second was Conrail, a government-owned railroad that salvaged several bankrupt railroads in the Northeast. And third was deregulation through the Staggers Rail Act of 1980, which passed a Democrat-controlled Senate by a vote of 91-4. Deregulation allowed the railroads to set their own prices and pave the way for innovations like truck trailers on flat cars, seen here at Horseshoe Curve in Pennsylvania. These three actions helped start a railroad renaissance that is only just now showing signs of slowing. Deregulation also made it easier for railroads to abandon or spin off unprofitable lines, and that's what happened to most of our tracks in Madison. Under the guidance of its bankruptcy trustee, the Milwaukee Road pared back its system. The most significant cut was its entire Pacific extension, but more important here were many secondary and branch lines. These included the first railroad through Madison, the Milwaukee and Mississippi. At the same time, the Illinois Central Gulf wanted to abandon its line to Madison, the one coming up from Freeport, Illinois. The state stepped in to purchase these lines and maintain local freight service, although this got off to a rocky start. The sad state of these lines did not help. The state initially used a few different operating companies. One of them even brought back the name Chicago, Madison, and Northern with a pretty nice logo. But like the others, it was short-lived. All of these operators had gone bankrupt by the end of 1984. A new company called the Wisconsin and Calumet then took over and did better, although it would close the former Illinois Central due to its poor condition and lack of business. Still, the Wisconsin and Calumet, or the Wicket as it became known for its initials, WICT, found success. And then, like a lot of successful upstart companies, it was acquired by a larger one, Wisconsin and Southern, which is the railroad we continue to see in Madison today. This is my drone photograph from July of 2021 with a Chicago-bound grain train running on the former Milwaukee Road, crossing Monona Bay, as well as the former Chicago and Northwestern. And as the Wisconsin and Southern found success, it too looked to expand. And that included leasing all of the former Chicago and Northwestern lines, including the one along Devil's Lake, seen here from the West Bluff Trail, as well as the former Milwaukee Road line to Watertown. As the Wisconsin and Southern grew and thrived, it also attracted attention. In 2011, it was acquired by Watco, a Kansas-based firm that owns dozens of railroads across the country. So far, Watco has retained Wisconsin and Southern's corporate image and their nice red and silver livery. This train here is carrying sand and gravel on the former Northwestern line bound for the Lycon plant in Oregon. The only railroad here that isn't part of the Wisconsin and Southern is the former Madison and Portage, which the Milwaukee Road never abandoned. Today, it is owned by the Canadian Pacific Railway, which sends a local freight train down from Portage a few times each week. Here it is at Goose Pond near Arlington. So that gives us our current railroad scene in Madison. The Wisconsin and Southern's base is the former Northwestern Yard at Johnson Street. Local freight trains still run several days a week on each line that remains in Madison. And their cars get combined into a big train that departs most mornings around sunrise, often just in time to snarl the morning commute, bound for Janesville and ultimately Chicago. Now here it is on a summer morning in 2020 as a pair of mallards take flight at lower left. Railroaders call this location MX, which is short for Madison Crossing. It has one of the newest pieces of track in the city, a curved connection that follows John Nolan Drive from the former Northwestern line to the Milwaukee Road. You can tell this was taken during the pandemic. John Nolan would be a lot busier at 7 o'clock on a weekday morning most of the time. Looking back at our historic rail map, most of these lines remain, at least within Madison proper, but their consolidation has led to some redundancy and also some new opportunities. Today, part of the Milwaukee roadbed is now the Capital City Trail on the east side, and across town on the west side, once the former Illinois Central had been abandoned, It soon became the Southwest commuter path. Here it is from Spooner Street in the 1970s with the train on the left, and in 2022 with cyclists passing on the right. The Rails to Trails movement has roots in Wisconsin. 3 rail trails converge in Elroy, all on former Chicago and Northwestern lines. They include the nation's first rail trail, the 32-mile Elroy-Sparta Trail, which begins 2 blocks north of the depot here and includes 3 tunnels. Back in Madison, the Southwest commuter path can be pretty busy on a Badger game day. We're actually developing an exhibition about rail trails that explore the notion of how railroads connect us even when they no longer exist. Now, this project is national in scope, but Wisconsin and Madison will both be featured, and we hope to debut the show here later this year or sometime next. We have an outstanding trail network here in Madison, thanks in great part to the railroads. We even have 2 rail trails that cross one another in Fitchburg. Here's an Illinois Central train leaving Madison and going over the Chicago and Northwestern line to Southwest Wisconsin. This is in 1975. And here's the same spot in 2022. The Northwestern line is now the Cannonball Path in front of us and the Military Ridge Path behind us. The Illinois Central is now the Southwest commuter path to the left and the Badger State Trail to the right. And it's a great ride from there down to the 7-acre dairy in Paoli, which was the topic of the last presentation in the Madison Trust series. This photo of the Capital Cities Trail is a little drab, but I wanted to line it up as closely as I could with the John Gruber photograph. Keep your eye on the spire of St. Patrick's Catholic Church popping up on the horizon there at right. Now here's John's photograph from 1955 with a Milwaukee Road train on what is now the trail and a Northwestern passenger train sitting at their station behind it. This looks west at the Blount Street crossing. And here's a side-by-side comparison. It's kind of a shame the MG&E office now blocks the Capitol, but that is a frequent challenge with then and now photography. And as our archivists digitize more of John Gruber's collection at the center, I've been doing more comparison shots. This is back at West Washington when that crossing guard tower still stood. And here's the same spot in 2022 with the coal center looming large in the background. Here's John's view looking the other way from West Washington with the Kroger warehouse on the left. And my comparison shot from 2022 with new condos in the distance and the GHC parking lot on the right. I stood in that parking lot for this view, looking back at the depot. So we could have this comparison from 1968 with 3 Milwaukee Road trains at the depot. It's a freight train at left, a local switcher sitting in the middle, and a football special pulling in from Milwaukee on the right. I have never seen 3 trains in Madison at the same time in almost 12 years of living here. But there are still trains in Madison, and even when they haul only freight, every carload keeps about 2.5 semi-trucks off of our streets and highways. The railroad's imprint on our city is deep, and their legacy is long and ongoing. Thanks so much for the chance to share some of it with you this evening. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Scott. Give me just 1 second here and okay, so people should be able to unmute themselves if they'd like to ask a question directly to Scott, or you can definitely put things in the chat too. We welcome any questions that people might have or comments.
Great job, Scott. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thanks, Bon. Thanks for tuning in. Bon French here is our chairman at the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, and a tremendous part of our success and just an all-around wonderful person. So thanks so much for joining us again tonight, Bon.
I'm actually a native Wisconsin. You know,
That's right.
My dad spent 40 years with Northwestern Mutual, Milwaukee, and we lived in Whitefish Bay in the 50s.
So you really didn't talk about the railroad that comes through from Marshall and Sun Prairie to Madison. That's what, the southern Wisconsin?
Oh, the Wisconsin and Southern. That would have been the line built of Madison and Watertown, which I mentioned as part of the Milwaukee Road towards the beginning of the program.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hey, Scott.
Yes,
Yeah, this is Mark Jones. Good
yes.
evening.
Good evening.
Hey, just saw Bond there. I saw a wonderful show by him a little while ago back in Illinois, but your show was absolutely a hit tonight. I really appreciate the background. I worked at North Freedom as a volunteer at Mid-Continent Railway. And of course, they have the Chicago Northwestern 1385 that ran into Madison several times over the years. And on the, I believe on this, was the circus train ever come there? I'm trying to remember.
I know the circus train came through. I know it was pulled by some other, yeah, I'm pretty sure the 1385 would have pulled it on some of those runs. It was pulled by several different steam locomotives over the course of the year. And we've got some great photographs of those in our John Gruber collection, and hundreds, if not thousands, of photographs of the 1385 running all over the state.
Well, that's wonderful. I really think you did a fine job of bringing it all together, because I'd never really understood the history of the railroads there. I did chase the ICG years ago. The school I was going to in Rockford had a furnace that malfunctioned, and so a buddy and I went up to Madison and chased that line in the tunnel at Belleville. Is that it? Belleville,
That's correct.
Wisconsin?
Yeah, that's correct. And that's on the Badger State Trail now.
So maybe in retirement, eventually here, I could ride a bicycle through some of these spots. I appreciate all that about the bicycle trails too. It's fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's a great way to reuse the infrastructure.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Scott, it looks like we've got a question in the chat.
Oh, sure.
Daniel?
Oh, yeah. Let's see. We do, yeah, so Daniel asked in the chat if we have any photographs in our collection showing trains servicing the Camp Randall military training grounds during the Civil War. I'm afraid we don't. Currently, our oldest holdings date from the 1890s. There's glass plates in our Jim Shaughnessy collection, which are mainly focused in the Northeast. We would love to acquire older works as we find them, but right now, a lot of our focus on collecting is with the living photographers who would have done film-based photography around that steam to diesel transition era, kind of a rich time for railroad photography, and a vulnerable time that, we want to make sure that these collections can be preserved as best as they can, but we would definitely love to acquire more older work. I was delighted to find, I did a presentation for the Badger History Group up north of Prairie du Sac on the former Badger ammunition plant. And as part of that, I was delighted to find that we do have a John Gruber photograph of a Milwaukee road train actually going into the plant. John couldn't get inside the plant to do any photography, but he did at least get a train at the edge of it. So that was a nice find that ties into a little bit of our military history here in southern Wisconsin as well.
There's something in the chat, Scott, about do we have Winston Link photographs?
We do have a number of Winston Link's prints. Many of those were donated by Tom Garver, who lives here in Madison and was Link's assistant in the field for a little while, and then his agent for many years later in life. Tom actually worked with us to put together a traveling exhibition about Link's prints that we took to exhibitions all over the country. Tom since asked we take that show out of circulation, but through the generosity of himself and a few other donors, we're acquiring a nice set of Link prints that we may be able to reconstitute into another exhibition at some point in the future.
And the rest of the question is whether they were steam era prints.
Yeah, those would all
in Madison.
Oh, well, and we have lots of, well, not lots, but we do have a fair number of steam era photographs of Madison railroads, primarily, not Links, but I don't think he ever photographed here. He did most of his work on the Norfolk and Western in Appalachia. But the John Gruber collection does get the kind of the tail end of the steam era here in Madison. Also, our Wallace Abbey collection, I showed one photograph of his in the show tonight. It gets a little bit of the steam era railroading here. And I should mention too that our archives are open to the public. It's usually best to email ahead to set up an appointment. We have a lot of our materials digitized and can handle requests electronically. We typically charge no fees for personal use or not-for-profit use. And we're always happy to provide images for people working on research projects or publications or anything else.
Hey, Scott, I see just a couple more.
Yeah.
We're just a little past 8, so if people need to go, we completely understand, but there's maybe a couple more questions. So why did Madison lose passenger train service?
Yeah, I mean, as we talked about a little bit in the presentation, there's a number of factors there, with the kind of the wholesale shift towards roads and airplanes. But the Milwaukee Road continued to run the varsity up until April 30th, 1971. That date's significant because on May 1st of 1971, Amtrak took over operation of most of the intercity passenger trains in the US. And Madison was not included in the national rail map for Amtrak as one of the ways they tried to scale back their costs a little bit. They took a hard look at which lines they felt had the best potential for passenger traffic. And unfortunately, Madison was not included about that. Obviously, there have been some efforts to bring that back. I think most of us here know the current status of those, but there's still possibilities. I think if anything was to happen, it would come on that line. So right now we have passing the Empire Builder runs through Columbus, Wisconsin on that line between Watertown and Portage that I talked about earlier. If we did get passenger service through Madison, it would probably come from Milwaukee to Watertown and then take the line from Watertown into Madison and then the line up to Portage and get back on the main line and then continue up to the Twin Cities that way. So it would basically be just kind of a diversion around the current main line. And that's the schemes I've heard discussed recently as the possibility of adding a second daily train between Chicago and the Twin Cities. We've gotten our hopes up before. We'll see if it actually happens this time or not.
Let's see, maybe one more question we've got. Are there any interior photos of the train stations, roundhouses, etc.?
Yeah, we have, in our collections, we have a few. John Gruber did some nice ones of the Milwaukee Road Station, especially in Madison in its final years. It's interesting now, I mean, if you go in and see what Roger Charlie's done there with motorless motion bicycles, he's actually brought back a lot of the station's earlier grandeur, and previous tenants did that as well there. In its final years under the Milwaukee Road, the Milwaukee Road actually built temporary walls and installed drop ceilings so that they could have offices inside the once grand waiting room. It was really kind of a sad state, but it was what the railroad needed to continue to do their freight service there. And the station itself, I think, is in much better shape now than it was in the 1970s. And we do have a few interior photographs of it. The Wisconsin Historical Society has some fantastic interior photographs of both the Milwaukee Road and the Northwestern stations. There are at least low resolution copies of those available on their website, and you can always work with them to get high-res images.
You might mention Jack Holsider, who works with the center and the Historical Society, who would know exactly about that.
Yes, yeah, no, we benefited mightily from, one of John Gruber's college friends, Jack Holsider, had a long career at the Wisconsin Historical Society. Some of you may have heard him on the radio at one time. He had a program there for a number of years. An excellent historian and editorial consultant for us who helped out on our project with the Chicago History Museum, looking at railroad workers in Chicago during World War II, and helped with a lot of the other projects we did at the center. So yeah, Jack's been a big part of the center's history.
I just wanted to say that I was glad for this. I'm watching from the middle of Kansas with snow and probably not as much as you've had. About 4 or 5 years ago, my wife and I drove up through there with a topographic map, and I found the Milwaukee station, and right where I can see where the roundhouse was. There's a walkway that people, a lot of college students seem like were walking along.
Yep.
I wanted to get pictures of that crossing in the middle of the lake, and there's just no place to stop on that road there. So I had to go back and forth and give my wife the camera and say, okay, shoot it now, okay, now, right there. So those drone pictures were just wonderful to see.
I got a drone for Christmas in 2019, and that quickly became priority one in Madison, was to get some trains at the Diamond and the lake out there. That's such a neat spot. Cool. And the air is the best way to see it.
And I was surprised to see that last train turn from one line to the other one. I didn't realize
that's actually the normal flow of traffic, because It's the Chicago and Northwestern's yard in Madison that the Wisconsin and Southern uses, but then they get on the Milwaukee Road to go to the Milwaukee Road yard in Janesville. And so that connecting track there was a nice way to put those together.
And Scott, when was that highway put in? Because
John Nolan
origi-
Drive would have been built in the late 60s. Jennifer might be able to tell us the exact date.
100 years, but there was no highway there.
No, that wasn't
And so
built
my
until
point
the,
about is the diamond in the lake was literally isolated.
correct.
You had to
Yeah.
get there by boat.
No, that's exactly.
Well, the thing that was the biggest struggle for me was trying to figure out where the Northwestern station was. And we drove back and forth. And I think, isn't there like a power plant there or something? And so I appreciated those pictures to try to get an idea where that was in there. But
Yeah, no, it's still there. But it is owned by MG&E, the Madison Gas and Electric. And it, without the platforms and the sign, it really, in my mind, looks about more like a bank than a railroad station if you don't know what you're looking for. But it is still there.
that building that you showed, that kind of a stone-looking building, that's there. Okay.
Yes.
But
Yeah, that still stands and it's owned by MG&E.
my question then to end is this somehow recorded that we can hear it again? Because I'd love to listen back and write down those streets. This is north of this street. This is over here by that street. And I'd like to get my map out because I was trying to figure out where that north station was that was on those lines heading north from there. And
Jennifer, I think you can give details about the recording, right?
Yes, we will have a recording available. We'll send the link by email. That'll be available for a limited time. But plenty of time for people who want to rewatch this again, take some notes. Scott provided a lot of great information. So we definitely want to provide that to anyone who missed it and to you guys to watch it again. So absolutely. I think
Yeah, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me with those. If you have any corrections, please let me know about those too. Certainly plan to give this again, hopefully actually for one of the center's members events. So if you want to see it again, you can also join us and watch it this summer. And definitely, these are always works in progress. So I welcome any feedback.
The one thing I would say though, just because this is about history, is you mentioned the dates of the first railroad in Madison, Scott. That was close to some of the first railroads in the entire country.
Yeah, no, I mean,
So we understand that it was really early.
Correct. Yeah, no, I mean, it was within less than a quarter century of the very first start of the railroads in the U.S. So, for this,
the first railroad in Chicago, which became the railroad the railroad capital of the country, was 1848.
Right.
And so you're only talking a couple of years later.
Yeah, 3 years after that, we had Milwaukee to Waukesha.
I just wanted to make sure everybody understood that context.
No, that's really good for context, Bond. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. It's an amazing presentation. I loved it. I learned so much about the railroad. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Just a reminder again, our specialty tour, we're partnering with the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. Really excited about that too. So that's September 17th. You can check it out. I'm sure it'll be on both of our social medias. We'll have it on our website. And there'll be more information on that. We're in creating the tour right now. So I know one of the questions was what buildings are on that tour. We're in that process right now, but there will be more information on our website once that becomes available. So
I think it's safe to say at least a couple of the ones we saw tonight might be on the tour.
Absolutely, for sure. The depot in West Wash, the building for sure, and hopefully, we'll have some, a photography exhibit type of thing that we're going to include too in this tour. So I think it's going to be a great one. So stay tuned for that too. So thank you all for joining us so much. And our next presentation is coming up in February, and with Jim Drager about the storefront 1930 storefront. So tickets are available on our website right now for that at madisonpreservation.org. So check those out too. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a terrific night.
Thanks, everybody.